here's my question before we go on.
Okay.
So I know we have many folks who probably this is their first time, even though we've done a couple of sessions already. So can you just tell us who you are, reintroduce yourself, whatever you want us to know about you?
Yes, I am Diana P. Cartwright. I self-describe as a integrative astrologer, and my mission is to make astrological wisdom accessible and use it in liberatory ways, so that we can heal collectively and get free. That's the goal.
Yeah, I love that. What does that look like with your clients?
Ooh, great question. A lot of the focus in my consultation work comes down to helping people be able to recognize themselves outside of maybe what they've experienced, and the framing of that experience, which is often rooted in social structures. So really trying to help people first connect with what is that basic energy, what are the strengths, what are the gifts, what are all these things that they bring into this life, which I have discovered oftentimes are challenged, limited, or, viewed in ways that are somewhat distorted because of the social systems that we live in.
Wow.
So that's my primary goal in consultation, is to help people really connect to that.
Mm-hmm.
And then the second goal would be to try to help them discover for themselves the kinds of practices that will help them connect to that on a more regular basis within the actual context of their lives. So acknowledging those limitations, those challenges, those biases or perceptions that other people have, and really helping people discover practical ways that they can continue to be true to themselves within those contexts.
Yeah. I'm asking questions right now thinking about someone who's listening, and they might say, "Oh, you're a life coach."
Yeah, and I think what's different about drawing from astrological wisdom, because I do coach people, I have coached people without the astrological lens. And what I have observed is different, is the precision of astrological science is unparalleled. I can so quickly be able to identify core dynamics in their life where without that view, it could take weeks, months, possibly even years. And that's partly because of what I was saying around how things become distorted. And it's also because a lot of material that we're working with is unconscious. We might not even know exactly how to talk about it. So it's almost like I can name something that then someone can say oh, yeah, that has been real for me. And no one has ever quite been able to name that for me. And I might not have even been able to name that for myself.
Yeah.
So I find that to be a key, asset of astrological wisdom. And I would say other assets that I feel are important that I bring to the table with astrological viewpoint is a connection to myth and story. So many of the planets are named after myths. And whether or not we think those myths are ones we want to continue to reinforce in our culture, I think when we can discuss things at the archetypical and mythical level, it changes our perspective and our relationship to those dynamics. It causes us to ask different kinds of questions and engage in themes in a different kind of way. I mean, I think that is the part of astrology that's a little bit more spiritual and less scientific. A little bit more, let me connect to a larger story, a cultural story sometimes, but also just themes of being a human on this planet, which have our experiences.
Yeah.
are different, but they also have a lot of similarity over the centuries and millennia. So that's important. And then a third thing that I think is really critical for me in my practice and how I came into astrology is actually being able to connect to the planets as resources. Whether you think of them as guides or you think of them as, like I was saying, like archetypical images, being able to actually resource yourself. I personally prefer to do that with the living sky. So that's far beyond any astrological software or app. It's actually being able to root yourself on the earth, connect with the sky, and know that you are supported in ways that can be seen, right? Like we can connect with the sky, and also in ways we can't always literally see. We have to feel it in our bodies.
Yeah.
And so those are the main reasons that I feel astrology is such a huge strength to be able to bring to the table in a coaching context.
Yeah. I love what you said, the connection to the living sky. I'm excited about this conversation and just you helping us to unlearn biases around astrology and
absolutely
it not being, what we think it is. And so let's just get into the questions.
Yes.
So you've written, and we asked you to come back because you've written this series. That is a very interesting, very insightful. I had never heard it presented this way, which was refreshing, around why magic had to be destroyed in order for capitalism to come into being and then dominate the world, basically.
Yes.
Which I would never have made that connection. We just say it's them, it's they, not knowing who them and they is, and no connection to astrology. But this is a part of a bigger series that you're writing, Uprooting Capitalism with Magic. So first, I just want to ask you, what motivated you to write this series?
It's a great question. I would say my own unlearning, first and foremost, my own unlearning. So you were talking earlier about how people come in with biases around astrology, and I had them. So I just want to name, anyone who has that experience, I get it. That's why actually I think I'm such a great person to be able to fulfill my mission, which is to make astrology more accessible and responsible, because I personally have had to go through a journey myself of peeling back a lot of layers around how astrology is practiced, what I think is actually useful, what feels like it's part of something that's not useful but is actually harmful. And that actually is part of an even bigger unlearning I've been doing, which has to do with, astrology is a part of it, but it really has to do with what is my role as a person in the time that we are in right now, which I truly believe are world-changing times.
Yeah.
So what is all the unlearning that is my responsibility to do? I think the astrological practice also helped me almost better appreciate history, a relationship to time, understanding that things come in cycles and waves and rhythms. I think it was Mark Twain who said, history may not repeat, but it rhymes, and really appreciating that rhythm and wanting to better understand what that rhythm is, and not just purely based on, the science of astrology with the planets and the angles and the degrees and the zodiac, but actually understanding the qualitative aspect of what has happened in history that has put us on a trajectory to where we are today as part of all of that unlearning. So what do I need to understand about the historical contexts so that I can better show up for these times and understand exactly how I got here? I mean, there's quite a bit of wisdom. And again, this is outside of what I found in astrology. I want to be very clear about that. This is mostly from people who are in a long tradition of liberatory practice, who observe that we can't really know where we're going if we don't understand where we came from. So it was part of that commitment that led me to start to want to discover more about aspects of history that don't get talked about.
Yeah.
And it was almost accidental that on that journey, I really started to pull these pieces together of my astrological practice and all of this unlearning I was doing both in that practice and just generally, and start to understand more about that relationship. And because I'm a writer, in addition to being a consulting astrologer, like I was very passionate and I'm, committed to this mission of making astrology accessible. Like I want to share what I'm learning with other people. I don't want to keep this to myself. This feels so important.
Yeah.
And so much of the history of what I learned, I felt has been intentionally veiled, hidden, under-discussed, misinterpreted, or I guess disinformation, right? Like we're living in this age of disinformation. It's been part of that. And so it felt even more important for me to try to create some clarity around this and really be part of, I'd like to see myself as being part of a lineage of people who are invested in medicinal history. And I don't know if you're familiar with this term, but there's quite a few people who very much believe that we can practice history and we can share histories in ways that actually help us heal. And that's what I'm really interested in. And being, and telling these untold stories specifically, from the perspectives of peoples whose social locations are often not dominant in our current paradigm is such a big part of that medicine.
Yeah. When you in the first part one of your article, you talk about magic, but what I appreciated about it was that you left it. There was no clear-cut definition of magic. So as a reader, you could take that based on your perspective. Some, for me, ancestral wisdom, the collective consciousness. What are some of the things that magic can be? I mean, I named my perspective, but just what I want to clarify, and I don't want anyone to dismiss what you're saying or devalue it by thinking, oh, it's witchy, it's taboo, it's out there. And so when you're referring to magic, what is magic? Outside of the stereotypical what we think magic.
Yes. And we're going to get into that term witchy. We are going to get into that. But in the meantime, I will say, I think the inclination to describe magic makes sense in terms of trying to understand what is our own relationship to magic at this point in time, as individuals. How are each of us coming to that word and what it means for us? I also think, though, that because we have been conditioned to define things in discrete ways that can be perceived as valid for other people, there can be a slippery slope with trying to define things. And I'm hesitant to do that because I don't want to play into that sort of carceral logic that's like, oh, it's this and it's not that. I would say it's anything that connects you to an animating life force. And that can be so many different things.
Yeah.
I think the only reason that we call it magic, or that I called it magic in this particular article, is to free people of the notion that it needs to be something rational. It needs to be something that we can actually explain, or that we can quantify somehow. But just acknowledging that there are experiences we have that are beyond logic. They are what I would call trans-rational. They have meaning, though. They still have great meaning. Even when, and maybe especially because we can't We can't fully explain or possibly even understand them.
Yeah. I agree. I think from a listener's standpoint, because labels, definitions, as you're saying, can be damning because we immediately go to the conditioned sense of, because we don't see it, because it's not in the physical, it's
Yes.
not real.
Yes.
And it is that spooky, taboo, depending, and I just want to name that for people, because I feel like someone will be sitting there listening and, oh, you're talking about astrology like in the newspaper, or, I can't entertain that because of my religious beliefs. What you're speaking to is something more divine, more spiritual.
Yes.
Without those the parameters that we're placing, or the boxes we're putting ourselves in, to not be open to the thought.
Yes, and I would say, and every religion does play a role in all of this. So I would just invite people who are listening to this and feeling that particular friction that you spoke around to understand or recognize that in every religious tradition, there is a mystical branch of the tree. There is a part of that faith tradition that acknowledges the mystery. The Holy Spirit is what it's referred to in Christianity, which is, a dominant religion. All religions have some way that they speak about the animating life force.
Yeah.
I am just encouraging people to appreciate that religious dogma, religious text can only capture so much of the human experience. Yeah.
So you mentioned in part one, you mentioned a deep dive into the dark histories and the rise of capitalism, especially in Europe.
Yes.
What were some of the most surprising or shocking discoveries on your own personal journey
Oh my
of
gosh.
unlearning? Yeah.
Yeah, there are so many things I could say, but I will speak now from my own experience as being a woman in midlife, a recent empty nester. So that part of my experience is very alive in me right now and absolutely colored some of what I learned around women in particular, their role in capitalism as basically reproductive, their use being primarily limited to reproductive aims. And, how that impacted the whole idea of a family and how we relate within the family structure because of that, and relating to my own personal experience around what my experience with my adult child is like now, and how that has absolutely been influenced by this idea of, without the identity of a mother or with the identity of a mother, like how that can become so central to what it is to be a woman in our culture. So there was definitely a lot of unpacking there around. I mean, a lot of it honestly was very validating. Like, oh, this is why I have this feeling of, even the phrase empty nest, like it speaks to kind of a vacuum. It speaks to a void, and is that a void of, is that an absence of a person, or is that an absence of an identity? And what is my attachment to that? And all of the different aspects of that attachment, and feelings of, particularly being in midlife, what is my usefulness now? How will I be perceived by my colleagues, by my family members, by other people that I relate to in terms of the value that I have in my community and my society? I felt validated around a lot of my insecurities around that by learning that all of that was constructed, that all of this was a way of keeping capitalism as a system that is, functioning. And that my feelings of inadequacy or fear or sorrow, so much sorrow and mourning, were absolutely connected to all of that contextual and historical, events. So that was a big one for me personally that I didn't fully anticipate, but was very alive for me.
Wow. So I think we're at this point where so we don't lose anyone.
Yes.
In your article, like, this is good stuff, but I'm also hearing, like, what's the point? Somebody is like, what's the point? So in your article, you talk about astrology, you talk about magic and the belief systems and how they basically were destroyed for capitalism to take place. Can you speak more to the essence of what you want us to gather? And then we'll go into more questions.
Yes, because that was another kind of something that I stumbled on as I'm learning this history, and I'm like, oh, there is a whole part of this history that I hadn't even expected to be there. And by the way, this connects to my astrological practice. And that had to do with what exactly happened and it relates to what I was sharing around my personal story, because it was for women who were serving roles in the community that were largely medicinal or shamanic, or, I mean, there's all different kinds of ways we could label that. What happened for those women? And conversely, what happened to men who were practicing, what could be referred to as high magic, and serving the state, essentially serving people who were in positions of power, and how those experiences were so markedly different. And that was absolutely contextual. It has to do with what I was sharing around the devaluing of women's contributions, and also the intentional effort to devalue and invalidate and even criminalize this kind of wisdom, this wisdom that has to do with us being connected to each other, us being connected to the land, us being able to hold responsibilities that have to do with both, our community and the land. And at the same time, to lift up and to institutionalize notions of rationality, which we talked about, scientific empiricism, that whole philosophy was critical for capitalism to take place, because what it did is it changed how people thought about themselves. And that was necessary, because the animating life force, being what it was and carrying people through, gave people a sense of implicit power. Like, I'm part of a community. I am part of an experience of being alive on this planet. And that is so profound and beautiful. So how does that get disrupted so that people can just become labor machines? Well, you have to mechanize people. They have to even think about themselves in such a way that they are not connected to the animating life force. They are simply machines. Our bodies are, here to serve a purely utilitarian purpose. There's no inherent wisdom. It's all external. It's all stuff we fill our minds with in, educational institutions. So, I mean, I hope I'm making sense, because there's a lot of different threads that had to be woven into place for all of this to become what we now know today as normal. So it can be kind of tricky to talk about, because
I
it's
love
so
how
normalized.
I love how you are framing it, because I believe we've got to go slow to go quickly. And so to frame it in that way, because as you were speaking, it's like, well, in my mind, it's, well, these power plays in these systems and structures, and we're seeing them played out, because that's the big point. Like, understanding the history of the past, we can now see it in our modern day. And immediately I'm thinking about institutions of education, and the conditioning that is there. And so would you say that it was capitalism first, which then built these other pillars in our society based off of capitalism?
That's a great question. I would say often we're referring to capitalism and we're naming a system that is comprised of different parts that are all interrelated and supporting one another. That's why it's so difficult to talk about, and also to actually think about how we're going to change. Because there are these, simultaneously reinforcing structures. Education is absolutely part of it, because what I was saying about devaluing the inherent wisdom that we all carry in our bodies was necessary for people to believe that they have to participate in specific systems. I mean, an obvious one today that we take for such granted is just the practice of medicine. If something isn't going right with our bodies, it's knee-jerk almost that we're going to think about going to a doctor. We're going to think about an expert. We're not going to think about our own, relationship to our bodies. And some of us will, but the majority of people won't.
Yeah.
And I would say it's the exact same thing with astrology. People will go to a consulting astrologer as an expert to help them fix or control something in their life, rather than to feel like, oh, this is something, whether we name it as astrology or not, like I have a capacity in myself to connect to a wisdom that I carry in myself.
Yeah.
And that is from where I'm going to derive the most power, the most wisdom about what's happening in my life. So there's a lot of interlocking pieces.
No, I love it. I mean, Rome wasn't built in a day.
That's right.
So,
that is exactly right.
You talk in part one, about around self-regulation and self-discipline. And you speak a lot about internalized oppression.
Yes.
And we hear especially in different areas, we hear a lot about internalized sexism, internalized racism, but you've said internalized oppression. Can you clarify for us what you are meaning, and then talking about how self-regulation and self-discipline are needed to combat that?
Actually what I talked about was how self-discipline and self-regulation are concepts that come out of the dominant paradigm. They are part of this internalized oppression. I learned through this history that, yes, women in particular were affected, not only because of the changes I talked about in terms of their economic value, but also because they were the rebels. They were the ones who tried to say, no, this will not happen. And as a result of that, they were persecuted, tortured, and murdered. And so, yes, women in particular felt the impact, but they certainly were not the only ones, because they were the glue. They were holding the fabric of the community together. So the entire community is impacted. The children, the males. I mean, there's no one person who's not impacted by that, pervasive, because it was across Europe over centuries of violence. Everyone was impacted. And so I'm glad you're asking this question, because I do want to make it very clear that when I'm talking about this, I'm not speaking to only specific social locations. I'm saying every person who lived in that time of a certain class, because there were definitely people in the higher classes that were not impacted. But the large majority of people were not in those classes and were absolutely impacted by this. And that legacy carries on to today, I believe, in a way that is internalized oppression. We are afraid. I mean, that's the clearest signal of it. We've internalized it because it now shows up in our own emotions, our own body, our own interpretation of events, our own way of thinking, all this stuff that we have been conditioned to feel and to think in ways that actually leave us feeling like we don't have power. We are, another way of thinking about it, if internalized oppression doesn't resonate, is learned helplessness. A way that we think we are so separate from a feeling of power, that we just kind of, that's our belief, is that we're just powerless and we need to do certain things in order to gain power. And that self-regulation, that self-discipline, even self-care, I think sometimes is presented in such a way that is very much part of this idea of like, this is how I get more control. This is how I get more power. Instead of just acknowledging, no, we already have it. Like, it doesn't have to be labor. It's like everything became labor instead of just acknowledging, because that idea is such a threat to the capitalistic system. Like that's the main thing that I hope people get, at least out of part one.
Yeah.
Is that the belief that we do have magic, animating life force lives inside each of us. All of us have strengths and gifts that give us the capacity to do so much with our lives. That very idea is a threat to the capitalistic system, because it does give us agency, choice, and a way that we could operate that would make us not reliant upon, the systems of power that exist right now.
Yeah. I love that. It has me thinking about just even talking to other colleagues who have started their own businesses and decided to leave the workforce and really pursue their dreams, and the challenges that are faced and the obstacles that are faced in the system for trying to be your own person, your own business. And many of them, unfortunately, have, I'm going to go back into it.
Yeah.
Because of the fear, like you said, that fear of, I'm not going to be able to live or survive if I don't have money or insurance. And so dance with the devil that rather than, the one that you may work out, but you're not sure yet. And so that has,
I mean, here's what people don't, and I've been on that journey myself. So I'm speaking from my own personal experience now and saying it took me years to learn this. What people don't often want to recognize is, even if you go off and you're working on your own, you're still in the system. You're still having to have clients or work in this, traditional business manner. You are still part of the economic structure that we are currently in. And I name that just to say that, for me, a lot of the pain when I was going through, especially early on in my entrepreneurial journey, had to do with me feeling like I wasn't doing enough. I have to be doing more.
Wow.
Which is in the whole idea of bootstrapping. It has everything to do with what I was talking about. Like, what is my perceived value in the marketplace? How am I able to demonstrate that to others? And how and what is my relationship to these people within this existing structure, where that value is going to be, that market value is going to be such a huge part of my relationship to them. This is so different from the way that communities were living before land enclosure. And by that's a phrase that refers to when people lived on shared land, that they were able to feel, before we had private ownership of land, and people were part of communities, and there was, a relationship to land and to each other that was based in an entirely different way of thinking about one another. Now it's like we can't even think about that because this is so normal to us, right?
Yeah.
So I have so much compassion for people on that entrepreneurial journey. And I guess I just want to say that there's no escape hatch for this. I personally feel like understanding this history can help us better understand our choices, but it's not an escape. It's an acknowledgement, and it's a taking responsibility for what we can and moving into, I hope, a world that will work better for more of us. And it's a lot of internal work. It's not as simple as just quitting your job.
Yeah. Yeah. So then where do you, because I remember in one of my, actually my couple of years ago, one of my supervisors was very much aware of their internal power. And I would always look at her and I was like, I want that for myself. And she would always say, you have to trust yourself. And I'm like, clearly that can't be it. There's more that you're doing something. And I literally remember being in her office, like, you're doing, what else are you doing to walk in your power in that way? And not believing that it was just trusting yourself. Again, to what you're saying, like, I need to do more. If I do this in my own strength, then I'm going to have this power, this internal power. What would you say to someone who's sitting here and they're listening? Like, how do I even start? Like, I don't even know what you mean when you're saying I'm in power.
Yeah, self-trust is a big part of it. It's why I was saying earlier, I think when we can recognize the strengths and the gifts that we inherently have and bring, for me, in my own journey in astrology, that was a game changer for me because a lot of the strengths and gifts I have are not always appreciated. I mean, I appreciate that in this conversation, like you are really like inviting me to speak to what's relevant for people. And we keep coming back to that. And I just love that. And I'll also just name about myself that a lot of things I'm sharing might be difficult for people to hear. And that's that's one of my gifts that I know I have, is that I'm able to see things outside of, I'm able to see edges and horizons in ways that other people aren't always able to. And I also am fiercely passionate about communicating about that.
Yeah.
And that's not always received well by other people. So, but me being able to acknowledge for myself the importance of that gift for me, if nothing else, has hugely liberated me to feel like I can be myself instead of trying to be someone else. Because I can't be someone else. I can really only be myself. So when I'm trying to be someone else, what's actually happening is I'm limiting my own energy and flow and expression and growth and all these things that are truly what my life is about, not, capitalistic production and wealth accumulation. Like, that's not really what I believe my life is about. I believe my life is about expressing my life purpose, relating to other people in such a way that it is in alignment with the expression of my life's purpose. And, if people disagree with me, that's fine. But I'm really here for the people who that resonates with, who also feel like that's what they're here for. And so by me feeling like I can free myself up to do that, I'm also able to connect to those people better rather than feeling like I'm just hiding or, forgetting all these different ways that can show up when we're not trusting ourselves, as you said. I think the only thing that is a doing thing besides trusting ourselves goes back to what I said in the beginning around being able to resource yourself, because there are so many places in life where we will continue to be challenged or invisibilized or, oppressed, whatever label we want to put on that. So being able to continue to come back to some kind of practice that helps us remember who we are, that we do have support on our side. If it's not seen, it's unseen.
Yeah.
so that we can keep moving forward
Yeah.
with the vision that we have and not feel despair or complacency or, all outrage. I mean, all of that has its place, but in terms
Yeah.
of us being able to move forward together, we got to have more than just that.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have to have more than just that, especially with what is going on in our current political,
Yes.
soon to be presidential, whatever that's going to be.
Yep.
You have to have something else to hold on to.
That's right. That's exactly right. When the
There was
storm hits,
there was a
what's your
question,
anchor?
right? What is your anchor? What are you anchoring to? I like to say knowing your hoop. What's in your
Yeah.
because we've all done the hula hoop thing growing up. I was an 80s baby, so that was like one of the big toys of the time. So but just, you have to be anchored. You have to have a strong core. What is your core?
Yes.
So that it is all not only for yourself but for others. What are you willing to stand on for yourself and for others? And that's how I view it for myself. I want to go back to, because it was something that you were talking about with the learned helplessness. And it just had me wondering, like, what do you, I can't remember exactly what we were talking about, because you said so many like nuggets, golden nuggets. Just the systems and just the practices that we have taken on, we have been conditioned to learn helplessness. How do you think generational, like, trauma, because that's what hit me in my head when you were talking, like, oh, is it like generational trauma, the collective trauma?
Yes.
Do you see, I know you see that some type of way, but if you can enlighten us on your thoughts with that.
Absolutely.
It's just interesting. Yeah.
It's both. It's a big part of why I want to share these untold histories, because I personally am a white-bodied person. My ancestral history is of people who migrated to Turtle Island from European countries in 16, 17, and 1800s. And learning this history, for me, helped me better understand what they came to the continent with. What were the beliefs they had? What were the relationships they had? What were the, as you said, the traumas, the embodied experiences that they had that have continued to shape my family line?
Yeah.
And which absolutely influenced, the stewards of the land, the indigenous people, of what we now refer to as the American continent, as well as all the black-bodied people who were brought in and traded. Like, that's so important. That context is so important for me to understand about my ancestors as something I can work with today, now, in myself. What are these edges? What are these points of stuckness, points of frozenness, that are age old? And I can think about like specific family histories, if that's helpful. But I feel like even those specific family stories are part of this thread that goes back and back and back, all the grandmothers I've had and how they felt about the conditions they were living in. And that still influences me. So absolutely, generational trauma and collective trauma, right? What we are, and I want to be clear when I say generational trauma or collective trauma, it's not a past thing. A lot of people think, it's something in the past, and that's not true. It's something that we're still living with today. We are both embodying it and we are enacting it. We are making it real.
Wow.
It continues to be something that we are participating in with consciousness or not. There's a lot of harm and violence that is present today. We don't even
Yeah.
need to reference centuries ago. I think the reason it's meaningful for me to do that is to understand how we got here. But
Yeah.
I don't want to lose sight of the fact that it's happening now.
No.
It's not completely in the rearview mirror.
I
Yeah, go
love the
ahead.
way you phrase that, because even in our climate, some would say we're some folks in power are wanting to reshape and rewrite history.
Yes.
And with that, as you're talking about the learned helplessness, generational trauma, and things like that, the big thing that stuck out for me just now is what you said, is knowing your stories.
Mm-hmm.
And there's so many of us, I think, I can only speak for US, but I'm sure there's other folks in other places, but there is this sense of I feel sometimes not connecting and really knowing our history. And where not only the country's history, but just the histories of our families.
Absolutely.
And so when you're talking about your grandmothers, I'm here like, okay, I may know a few, but I don't know a lot. Like a lot of history, depending on the group, or just we just didn't talk about those things.
That's
So
right.
how do we find our story to start? Like, how did you?
Oh, wow. That's a whole other thing I could share about, and I will share. Yes. A lot of layers to that. And just to normalize, like, I definitely have talked to, friends of mine that are Black-bodied people who come from a history of those histories have been erased. It is so hard to find the threads, and I just want to name that I appreciate that particular challenge. That is personal, if that's your experience. My experience is more one that there were secrets, there were lies, there were things that weren't shared. There, it's you could maybe track. It's maybe a little bit easier to use ancestry.com and create a family tree, but that doesn't mean you actually know the stories. And even if you try to do what I've tried to do, which is talk to living ancestors, that's not always a guarantee, because you're relying on other people to be honest with you. And you're still getting things secondhand. So a lot of my practice actually has been trying to invite in, this might be radical for some people, but you had mentioned earlier, this is one way you even might think about magic, is to simply invite in ancestors that aren't living anymore. If they want to communicate to me something important, that I'm available to hearing that. And it's not going to maybe come in an obvious way. So I really have to have my antenna up and be looking for that information. And I've been truly amazed how much I have been able to learn that way. I began that practice really just in faith, based on one of my teachers, Lama Rod Owens, who, talks a lot about the value of that practice. I thought, fine, I'll start doing this. Let's see what happens. And I have been amazed. So much of what I think I've learned about my ancestors and my relationship to them has actually been through that practice of just trying to be available to hearing what their story is. And it's not linear and it's not logical. It comes in symptoms in my body, me recognizing certain fears that pop up and wondering, where does that come from? Or, having a specific dynamic with a living relative and thinking to myself, what is the pattern there? Where, what is the lineage of that pattern? Right. There's a great book I can recommend that's on this topic of generational trauma called Break the Cycle. I highly recommend it. I think it's really well written and it's very practical. Written by a clinical psychologist, I believe, who is, I think, of a Caribbean ancestry. So she brings in a very multicultural lens. That's one place that I've found has, like, that's a resource I could point people to if they're looking for more on this topic. And I'd say, the idea of me learning history plays into this because even if I don't know individual stories of my family members, even knowing stories of what was happening in the communities that they were in tells me about them. It's a very individualist notion, and I personally was always put off by by history,
Mm-hmm.
growing up because I didn't like the individualist approach. I didn't like memorizing names and dates and locations, but the contextual stuff, what's actually happening in the community, the thematic stuff, like that is also critical. Like I can tell you, my certain branch of my family tree had a subsistence farm in West Texas in the Depression. Like that
Mm.
context has influenced me as much as the individuals,
Yeah.
right? Because their
Yeah.
experiences in that context absolutely flavored who they were and thus who I am.
Yeah.
So I think even if you don't know the individuals, the locations, the places, and knowing the history of those places, again,
Yeah.
very land-based, can give you a lot of story.
Yeah. That's helpful because I don't want anyone to walk away um having this romanticized view of their history as it's being rewritten, so to speak. Like we're America's great,
Yeah.
we're the winners.
Yep.
Other, atrocities that happen, which happen all over the world, never happen. And yeah. And I also, there's another group of people I think that you mentioned who don't even know where to start.
Yes.
But you've given them something like, here's a start. Here's another way to think about your history as you are also a part of history.
Yes.
Because we are now and I think
That's
that
right.
needs to, when you said it, I just imagine or visualize someone sitting here, a group of people, and history is happening. So then you do have the power
That's
to
right.
begin to move and do things differently. So I just wanted that to, I love the way that you are breaking it down for people while still having us raise all boats
Yes.
in this process.
Yes. Mission number one.
Um,
Mission number one.
You mentioned that astrology must be seen as non-threatening and
Mm,
somewhat distorted in order to fit into the current social status quo to survive in the
yep,
current paradigm.
yep.
How do you think that modern astrology supports this status quo? And
Oh
what
my God.
aspects do you see being altered or suppressed?
Such a juicy question.
I thought you would like that one.
I do. Where do I start? I would say I'm going to speak about my own experiences again, because actually, this is a big part of what I think is responsible astrological practice.
Mm,
And I find it shocking how little this is actually done. How
mm,
often you'll listen to an astrology forecast or anything, and you will never hear a word from that astrologer about how they know that to be true.
mm.
You know, what are their own
Yeah.
experiences? To me, that's a very colonial practice to be like, I know things, let me tell you. You know, instead of, no, this is what I know because of my own experience. This is what I'm referencing my knowledge from. And, um, and therefore what I can speak to. And it may not be the only truth out there, but I do feel confident that it's my truth. And so I'm going to speak to it as such, right?
Yes.
Instead of an objective idea of truth, instead of there's only one truth and
Yeah.
I own it and you need to
Yeah.
believe it. I don't believe in that way of practicing astrology or any science, in particular, any science at all. I'm super skeptical of that. I'm definitely someone who has more of a practice that's not just inclusive of various perspectives and worldviews, but also just acknowledges that no one person has omniscience. Like,
Everything.
that's not the reality we're in. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'll talk about my experience of going to different astrologers and feeling like they were talking to me in that way. Like, I know you better than you know yourself, and kind of
Mm.
feeling insulted or offended or unsure about that. You know, if I
Yeah.
think I'd been a little bit less confident in my truth, I think I could have been even more harmful. And instead, for me, it was just kind of a feeling of like, wow, you really didn't see me. You
Wow.
know, you kind
Yeah.
of saw past me. Like, you just barely saw past me. Um, so I think that's one way that astrology kind of modern, you know, status quo, not status quo, predominant astrology factors into this, is very much this
Yeah.
idea that, like, there's one objective truth. I'm an expert. Come to me and I'll tell you what it is. I don't think that that's true. I think that any astrologer that I do meet with now, it's a relationship. It's what do they know and they can share with me. What do I share about my experience with them so that they can better understand the context of
Yeah.
what's actually happening for me, and be able to speak to that. Um, you know, more not just specifically through the science, but ethically
Mm.
through the
Yeah.
relationship. You know,
Yeah.
like, can you see that framing that in XYZ way, or saying something to me in ABC way, would not actually be helpful to me, would
Yeah.
actually make me more self-critical or feel more helpless about my life.
Yeah.
You know, can you instead help me see possibilities, choices I have? And it's difficult to find these astrologers. I can tell you, I've had a number of readings. I've been to so many different teachers because I'm really interested in all the traditions of astrology. That's what I mean by integrative. I'm really interested in what
Yeah.
wisdom can be drawn from different lineages. And so I've observed and interacted with a lot of different astrologers, and I would say predominantly it's still, and even an app. So many people have an experience of astrology through an app, and that's like, there's no relationship.
Yeah.
Like, the whole experience of being on an app is, this app is objective truth and is going to tell me something, instead of, no, like, there's a human being that's interpreting wisdom through their own gifts,
Yeah.
right? And then through your gifts, you receive what's true from that and share back. Like, to me, that's actually the true definition of wisdom, is it's that multiplicity. It's not the one person holds it. So
Yeah.
that's probably like the number one thing that I wish would shift within astrological practice.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, just uh, a lack of that relational element.
I'll say it because I feel like
Please.
you're going to phrase it in a like a positive way, a more diplomatic way. I just remember having, I think, a shift for me as I was going to readers and looking for um, them to provide something to me externally or to validate what I'd already felt but didn't trust myself, like you said. And I remember one reader in particular who was having a really bad day. And the way that the reading came out, that energy was there behind it. So it was the aha as I was sitting there and the veil got lifted. It's like, what the hell am I? Like, you got your own problems. What am I sitting here for listening to you and you're adding bitterness and the energy? And I mean, I was very much able to feel it. They were going through something in a relationship and you're taking it out on my reading. And I said, why didn't I just trust myself in the first place? Because the things that the downloads that I was getting, the ahas, the revelation, and I believe that's wisdom also is revelation
Yes.
because there's knowledge. You can read a book, but if you have the wisdom that you're sharing with us, that's revelation. That's not going to be revealed to me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be talking to you right now.
Right.
So I think that taps into what you're also talking about with gifts and your perspective. But what it did for me was to say, I need to get in touch with the internal reader, the shaman, the whatever inside of me, because the higher power, whatever you call it, is accessible to everyone. And so, like you're saying, there is no gateway. There's people who can provide you perspective from lived experience, which is wisdom, if you've learned the lessons. But just it upset me. It really upset me. Like, are you doing this to everyone? And then it also bothered me in the sense of that power to operate in that way is sacred. Everyone has a calling that's sacred, and you've got to protect that. So you have to make sure that you are in a space where you can do that for someone else. And if not, just say you can. But it just left me very frustrated, but in a good way. My eyes were open to stop relying on everyone who's saying that they can do this. You have to trust yourself in this to guide you. And I think that was the lesson that I learned from that situation. And I haven't been back to
I love
anyone
that
in that.
I love that you still received the gift. That's so cool. So I just want to acknowledge that. Kudos to you.
Well, thank you.
You know,
Well,
you made some lemonade there. I see that.
It really, what bothered me, because we're human, it's like you have to cleanse yourself. You need to search your heart, search your energy, like you said, search yourself.
Yes.
To enter into that with someone, that relationship, as best as you can. And if you're not, one of my triggers is if you just can't be honest. If you can't be honest with yourself, that's
what it is. That's what it is.
So just say, you know what, Christina, let's reschedule. I'm just not into this. It's like, okay, but it did give me an eye, like, okay, you can trust yourself. You can trust that intuition. Like you said, and as a woman, just remembering the stories of aunts and grandmothers who had passed before, and they had the strong sense of intuition. And then it also being something that it was kind of spooky. Or my mom would say every woman was crazy. Like, all the women on her side of the family went crazy. That's what she would say. And so it spooked me as a little kid of, they all went crazy? Like, they were just...
Wow, let's talk about that. If you don't mind, I'd love to talk about that, because as I'm thinking about, it's a sacred task. And unfortunately, because it often is devalued, as I've gone into great depth about,
Yeah.
even someone who's practicing the sacred task can forget that it's sacred.
Mm. Yeah.
And that's really a tragedy. And also can forget that they have their own wisdom and can be honest with themselves and follow and trust their own sense of their capabilities, and I say that just to humanize, because I've heard this, not the first time I've heard this story, and I've shared my own story, so this is a thing. But here's the thing, like astrology, like every profession or practice, has a spectrum of people in it. Some people have different, and that's why I'm very clear with people what my mission is, what my practice is about, because that's the best I can do for someone, is to let them know where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
And a lot of astrologers don't do that. And I think that is a mistake, because I think they also take themselves out. But I want to say, because they're a part of the dominant paradigm and are not doing the unlearning I'm doing, it's natural to them. It's what they think is expected of them. I mean, I've been to these astrology conferences. I've seen how they go down. And it's everything I was just talking about in terms of there's a teacher, there's a way that you learn the knowledge, and the sacredness is in some traditions more than others, but it's very academicized profession, and so that's playing a role in, and it's more work. It's the same way as if I was going to see a doctor or a therapist or any other person who's in a healing profession. I'm going to do my research and I'm going to test some things, because there's such a wide variety of people and how they practice.
Yeah.
It's not like you're going to go to an astrologer and everything's going to be great. Like, that's oversimplification, and that's kind of magical thinking. I believe in magical practice. I believe in magical, embodiment, but I don't believe in magical thinking, which is like imagining something that's not real. It's just not real that you're going to go to astrologer and everything's going to be fine. Like, no, we're still living in this paradigm where people have drunk some toxic juices. And even the most gifted of us, because of the systems that we live in, and I'm going back to what was said about your relatives, to hold that sacred duty. I mean, there are even significations in the astrological chart that I personally feel like are based in when this shows up in our paradigm, it can look like. But I always want to hold it with, well, what would it look like if it wasn't in our paradigm? What today we call mental illness, in times before would have been called a gift. Would have been called a sacred role in the community. You see visions, you hear voices, you have a really strong intuition about things, you follow the beat of your own drum, even if it's different from what the tribe is saying is acceptable. Like this, now we've pathologized. We've made it so there's something wrong with you and you need to get yourself fixed. And that is absolutely part of the paradigm.
Wow.
So it's difficult to carry these sacred tasks in the times we're living in. It's super difficult, because even if you're not already feeling like you're at the edge of reality, then now you suddenly have to deal with the onslaught of violence against you. That alone will make you sick. Sick in the head, sick in the spirit, sick in the body. It's so much easier to go the path of least resistance and do the dominant astrology thing. Put your little Instagram ads up, tell people to do their little new moon ritual, whatever's going to sell. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And some people might be doing that very ethically, so I'm not trying to disparage that entirely. I'm just trying to say that there's a reason for all of this that you're talking about, the harm. It's so tragic.
Yeah. Because I felt, my mother is now passed. And I see things within myself and I see things within my younger sister that it was like, man, she's no longer here, or my aunt for that matter, are no longer here for me to even ask about certain things that my mom was always afraid of it. And I think she also had certain gifts that she was afraid to tap into.
Here's what's so interesting. And as if you go and read parts 2 and 3, I go a lot more into the violence. The violence that was part of stripping the world of magic and getting us all in this capitalistic, factory mode.
Yeah.
And I wonder, was the fear of the gift, or was the fear of having the gift and living in the world with the gift? Because that's understandable fear.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm talking about women being murdered.
Yeah. Yeah.
Under a freaking suspicion.
Yeah. Wow.
That's some high stakes. So completely understandable fear.
Yeah.
And not an actual fear of the magic or the spook. It's interesting. We call it spooky, like whatever it is, and maybe even a listener resonates with that. And if they've gotten this far into the episode, because they might have already turned it off if that was the case. But if there's some fear in you that's about that, you might want to investigate in yourself. Is that fear about what's inherently within this, practice, these different rituals or whatever that I've been talking about? Or is your fear actually what happens if you step into that direction?
Yeah.
What that means in terms of your social life, your identity, all these things that might come into question.
Yeah. The fear of shining.
Yes.
Yeah. Or your potential. What do they say? Your untapped potential. Okay, as we come to a close, you said it earlier, but just to put a pin in it and make it really plain for people, the takeaways that you would want us to walk away with for this, the part 1, and understanding about astrology and your magic and capitalism.
I mean, I think the main takeaway is about being curious about what you've thought about astrology and where those ideas have come from, curious about yourself and how you think about yourself, and how much of your self-perception is based on, your societal conditions versus the essence of who you are.
Yeah.
And potentially, the other curiosity we talked about is like different stories, histories, if we want to call them that, or narratives, particularly those in your family and in your community that might be carried over, might need healing, might need your presence and your compassion as we think about whatever chapter we're collectively moving toward.